We all watched with amazement and fear as Donald Trump won the elections in the most powerful country in the world. Without another, better alternative, it was a catastrophic bomb that excluded Americans believed would launch them further into a corrupt system, owned by the 1%. The new president quickly surrounded himself with millionaires, Wall Street predators, and military generals, lowered taxes on the rich, and reactivated the wars that feed the military complex governing the United States. Nothing was going to change. The system had simply thrown up Trump.
Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere.
Those days are over. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all. You're wonderful. Thank you, America. Thank you. And may God bless the United States of America.
Millions of victims and misery all over the planet is the price an empire is willing to pay to maintain its power, unless everyone, starting with the Americans, take the necessary steps to prevent it. In the coming minutes, we will discuss uncomfortable truths, the origins of the world's current chaos, and how the United States government functions. Not being afraid to know the truth and act accordingly brings us a little closer to peace.
And that is the most important topic on earth, peace.
Over 4 centuries, the British Empire came to control a quarter of the Earth's surface, including Australia, North America, and the Indian subcontinent, and together with France, divided the Middle East and Africa. It consolidated its powers with dozens of wars in which millions of people were enslaved and many more died. Some of the most serious conflicts and the misery that it created continue to this day, such as the forced division of Pakistan and India based on religion, which forced an abrupt displacement of 15 million people and caused the deaths of 2 million more. The savage repressions and bombings of rebellions in some of its colonies like Iraq and Yemen, the creation of concentration camps for hundreds of thousands of people in Malaysia, or in the war against the Boers in South Africa and Kenya during the Mau Mau Revolution. As well as the cruelty shown during the famine of their neighboring Ireland in 1845, that cost the lives of 2 million people, and to which the British colonial governor Charles Trevelyan said, "It was an effective measure to reduce the population, in addition to a punishment from God for the laziness of the Irish." The English took advantage of the occasion and coerced them en masse into forced labor. Beginning in 1606, during the reign of Elizabeth I, England was enriched with the opium traffic from India to China. In 200 years, it had turned a third of the population into addicts. When the Chinese government tried to fight the epidemic that was consuming the country and ban the use of opium, England declared war. The opium industry shared naval logistics with the slave trade, one of whose leaders was Sir John Hawkins, whom the Queen knighted for his services to the grand splendors of the British Empire. History must also note the inhumane attitude of Winston Churchill during the Indian Famine of 1943, one of the largest in history, during which England continued to remove 65 million kilos of wheat from India every 6 months to feed the British soldiers fighting in World War II. Nearly 5 million Hindus died of hunger, to which Churchill simply replied that this was caused by them reproducing like rabbits. The last great conquest of the British Empire happened at the beginning of the 17th century, when it almost exterminated the Native American population, occupied its territory, and enslaved millions of people taken from Africa. English ships made more than 10,000 trips filled with slaves to America, transporting more than 3 million Africans. At least 9 million more were taken by the Portuguese, Spanish, French, and Dutch. Upwards of 4 million people died during these voyages. Many historians calculate the genocide of the conquest of America to be around 90 million people, 10 million in North America, and 80 million distributed between Central and South America. From the wealth generated in the 2 world wars by the military industry, the United States achieved the greatest ascent into dominance in history and created an economy based on war, in the hands of bankers and arms manufacturers, who designed a pyramid scheme where its central banks became the ones to print the money and lend it to the government. The population would then pay the interest with its taxes, and thus ensure the steady flow of wealth to the 1%. This type of economy forces the United States to enter into conflicts constantly, and that is why it is forever searching for enemies, real or imaginary, or uses excuses as unlikely as the struggle for freedom or democracy anywhere in the world. In recent decades, it has found new markets in the war on drugs and against terrorism. The latter is often the result of previous invasions, in which it has destabilized countries and has managed to radicalize part of the population, as was the case of the Islamic State after the invasion of Iraq, or that of Al-Qaeda after the war in Afghanistan.
Ladies and gentlemen, before the podium, the 11th Army Cavalry Regiment's M1A1 Abrams tank. This is the 3rd generation, the main battle tank produced in the United States.
Went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They've just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
Currently, the United States has around 1,000 military bases on 5 continents, a quarter of which are secret. In their own territories, they have 4,000 more. Their armies of land, sea, and air control the 2 major oceans, world communications, and outer space. Plus, they have over 1.5 million soldiers who voluntarily enlist. Belligerence, military might, and its unsustainable economy designed to increase inequality make the United States the greatest threat to world peace and well-being. Their current spending on weapons is greater than the next 7 countries on the list combined. 40% of their defense budget and 100% of their intelligence budget are secret. The total figure, which exceeds $1 trillion.
The United States of America is the most powerful nation on earth. Period. Period. It's not even close. It's not even close. It's not even close. We spend more on our military than the next 8 nations combined. Our troops are the finest fighting force in the history of the world.
On July 4th, 1776, the American descendants of the British colonists became independent from England. A century later, and after the success obtained in their own territory, they decided to continue spreading outward. The first step was to confront the hedonistic Spanish Empire, which ruled Cuba with tyranny and corruption. So much so that on October 25, 1896, the Spanish governor of the island, General Valeriano Weyler, gave the order to create the first concentration camps in history, where hundreds of thousands of Cubans would die. Years later, the British with the Boers and the Nazis with the Jews would follow suit. The war began when the United States falsely accused Spain of the sinking of the Maine battleship, after an explosion in which 266 crew members died. President McKinley got Congress to authorize a declaration of war and invaded Cuba. The easy victory ended with the Spanish Navy and brought with it the possession of its colonies in the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, and the beginning of an interventionist policy in the Pacific. The United States had ceased to be a country, but had become the thing it hated most and fought against for its freedom. Now, it was an empire. The financial and military-industrial complex that governs the United States has no scruples with overthrowing democratic governments, annihilating social movements, creating paramilitary groups, or supporting dictators that enforce totalitarian control over their populations while looting their countries. Washington supports more than 20 dictatorships. Since 2002, after the attack on the Twin Towers, the United States Congress, in clear violation of the Constitution, granted the President the power to declare war, not excluding conflicts involving the use of nuclear weapons. Until then, the occupants of the White House needed to provoke an incident or simulate attacks against American interests to get congressional authorization. These farces are known as false flag attacks, and in recent history, there are numerous examples. Here are 6 of them. In 1915, a German submarine torpedoed and sank the American ship the Lusitania, killing over 1,200 people. The Germans had been unknowingly alerted by the U.S. Secret Service that the passenger ship was carrying weapons. This allowed President Wilson to enter the First World War. In 1941, the economic blockade of Japan provoked the desperate bombing of Pearl Harbor, in which 3,000 American soldiers died. Washington knew in advance of the attack, but did not warn the command in Hawaii in time. Roosevelt then had the justification he needed for Congress to approve entering the Second World War. A day that would live in infamy indeed.
A state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
In 1964, the U.S. government accused Vietnam of torpedoing one of its ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. 40 years later, McNamara, the Secretary of Defense at the time, confessed that the attack never happened.
They jointly agreed that joint retaliatory action was required.
It was just confusion. And events afterwards showed that our judgment that we'd been attacked that day was wrong.
The incident allowed President Johnson to declare war on Vietnam, in which 60,000 American soldiers and 3 million Vietnamese lost their lives. In 1967, during the Six-Day War against the Arab countries, camouflaged Israeli planes bombed the American ship Liberty. Its objective was to force the United States to attack Egypt. There were 34 American soldiers killed and 171 injured. In 1990, the United States, which had secretly helped Kuwait conduct cross-border oil drilling to steal from Iraq, secretly informed Saddam Hussein and assured him that they would not oppose if he wanted to take oil wells from Kuwait. As a result, Iraq invaded them. Iraq had been an ally of the United States in the war with Iran and a large buyer of American arms, including chemical and biological weapons. Immediately, the American media began a massive campaign to demonize Saddam Hussein.
America at war. Tonight, shock.
And Defense Secretary Cheney handed over satellite photographs of thousands of Iraqi troops invading the country to the government of Saudi Arabia. Arabia was forced to ask for the intervention of the United States and allowed it to establish military bases in its territory, which eventually became permanent. This caused the revolt of extremely radical Islamic jihad groups, launched characters like Osama bin Laden into power, and gave rise to the appearance of Al-Qaeda. Ten years later, images from Russian satellites on the same dates showed that there had been no invasion into Saudi Arabia by Iraq. In those days, the declarations of a young Kuwaiti nurse before the U.S. Congress were broadcast internationally. In the midst of tears, she spoke of how the Iraqi soldiers took babies out of incubators and murdered them.
And left the children to die on the cold floor.
Sometime later, it became public knowledge that the alleged nurse was the daughter of a Kuwaiti ambassador and had been trained by Washington for her masterful performance. But the propaganda already achieved its goal, and the Gulf War was underway. The world attended the first conflict with the story broadcast live. More than 1 million people died, the vast majority civilians. In addition, the burning of hundreds of oil wells and huge spills in the Persian Gulf produced one of the greatest environmental disasters in history.
يعني هو يموت بس مو هسه يموت قريبا.
Everything that American troops have done in Iraq, all the fighting, now all the dying, the bleeding and the building and the training and the partnering, all of it has led to this moment of success.
On September 11th, 2001, the world shuddered with the attacks on the Twin Towers of New York, in which nearly 3,000 people died. The government did everything possible to obstruct the investigation, and its official report is full of inconsistencies, and has been rejected by a large portion of the population, and by independent experts and researchers. This is the version that they wanted everyone to believe.
On the morning of September 11, 2001, 19 men armed with box cutters directed by a man on dialysis in a cave fortress halfway around the world using a satellite phone and a laptop directed the most sophisticated penetration of the most heavily defended airspace in the world, overpowering the passengers and the military combat-trained pilots on 4 commercial aircraft before flying those planes wildly off course for over an hour without being molested by a single fighter interceptor. These 19 hijackers, devout religious fundamentalists who like to drink alcohol, snort cocaine, and live with pink-haired strippers, managed to knock down 3 buildings with 2 planes in New York. While in Washington, a pilot who couldn't handle a single-engine Cessna was able to fly a 757 in an 8,000-foot descending 270-degree corkscrew turn to come exactly level with the ground, hitting the Pentagon in the Budget Analyst Office where DoD staffers were working on the mystery of the $2.3 trillion that Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld had announced missing from the Pentagon's coffers in a press conference the day before, on September 10th, 2001. Luckily, the news anchors knew who did it within minutes.
Osama bin Laden.
The pundits knew within hours.
Osama bin Laden.
The administration knew within the day.
Terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them.
And the evidence literally fell into the FBI's lap.
That a hijacker's passport was found blocks from the World Trade Center crash site, if you can believe that.
But for some reason, a bunch of crazy conspiracy theorists demanded an investigation into the greatest attack on American soil in history. That investigation was delayed, underfunded, set up to fail, a conflict of interest, and a cover-up from start to finish. It was based on testimony extracted through torture, the records of which were destroyed. It failed to mention the existence of WTC-7, Able Danger, P-TECH, Sibel Edmonds, OBL and the CIA, and the drills of hijacked aircraft being flown into buildings that were being simulated at the precise same time that those events were actually happening. It was lied to by the Pentagon, the CIA, the Bush administration, and as for Bush and Cheney, well, no one knows what they told it because they testified in secret, off the record, not under oath, and behind closed doors. It didn't bother to look at who funded the attacks because that question is ultimately of little practical significance. Still, the 9/11 Commission did brilliantly answering all of the questions the public had, except most of the victims' family members' questions, and pinned blame on all the people responsible, although no one so much as lost their job, determining the attacks were
failure of imagination.
Because
nobody in our government, at least, and I don't think the prior government that could envision flying airplanes into buildings.
Except the Pentagon, FEMA, NORAD, and the NRO. The DIA destroyed 2.5 terabytes of data on Able Danger, but that's okay because it probably wasn't important. The SEC destroyed their records on the investigation into the insider trading before the attacks, but that's okay because destroying the records of the largest investigation in SEC history is just part of routine record keeping. NIST has classified the data that they used for their model of WTC-7's collapse, but that's okay because knowing how they made their model of the collapse would jeopardize public safety. The FBI has argued that all material related to their investigation of 9/11 should be kept secret from the public, but that's okay because the FBI probably has nothing to hide. This man never existed, nor is anything he had to say worthy of your attention, and if you say otherwise, you are a paranoid conspiracy theorist and deserve to be shunned by all of humanity. Likewise him, and her. And her, and her, and him. Osama bin Laden lived in a cave fortress in the hills of Afghanistan, but somehow got away. Then he was hiding out in Tora Bora, but somehow got away. Then he lived in Abbottabad for years, taunting the most comprehensive intelligence dragnet employing the most sophisticated technology in the history of the world for a decade, releasing video after video with complete impunity and getting younger and younger as he did so, before finally being found in a daring SEAL team raid which wasn't recorded on video, in which he didn't resist or use his wife as a human shield, and in which these crack special forces operatives panicked and killed this unarmed man, supposedly the best source of intelligence about those dastardly terrorists on the entire planet. Then they dumped his body in the ocean before telling anyone about it. Then a couple dozen of that team's members died in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan. This is the story of 9/11, brought to you by the media which told you the hard truths about
his head could be seen to move violently forward.
And
they took the babies out of the incubators.
And
mobile production facilities.
And
the rescue of Jessica Lynch.
If you have any questions about this story, you are a batshit paranoid tinfoil dog-abusing baby hater and will be reviled by everyone. If you love your country and/or freedom, happiness, rainbows, rock and roll, puppy dogs, apple pie, and your grandma, you will never ever express doubts about any part of this story to anyone. Ever. This has been a public service announcement by the Friends of the FBI, CIA, NSA, DIA, SEC, MSM, White House, NIST, and the 9/11 Commission. Because ignorance is strength.
The number of skeptics increased exponentially when information was released about a scheme of real estate transactions, collections of insurance, and stock operations that made millions for a small group of people, who apparently knew that something was going to happen. One of many surprising details was that days before the attack, the contracted agency for the Department of Defense in charge of the Twin Towers, called Securicom, had removed the security guards and the dogs trained to identify explosives. One of the co-owners and directors of that company was Marvin P. Bush, the president's brother.
One of the problems, not specifically on this issue, just in general, let's put it this way: money trumps peace sometimes.
The suspicion that September 11th could be another false flag case increased, with the recent declassification of papers from the Kennedy era, in which the CIA suggested simulating terrorist attacks, such as bombings, massacring civilians, and crashing planes into U.S. territory, allowing them to blame Cuba, and in that way, justify the invasion of the island. Kennedy was opposed to the war and wanted to end the criminal and mafia-like actions of the CIA, as well as suggesting the dismantling of the agency.
The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. We do not want a war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression.
The attacks of September 11th allowed the defense budget to be multiplied, and allowed Congress and the American citizens to approve the creation of new laws that gave power to the Pentagon to intervene in any part of the world, militarize the police throughout the country, spy on citizens, imprison them without the need for a trial, use the army in cities, and even murder without repercussions. The word defense was replaced by a diffused concept of security, which allowed cuts in all types of rights and freedoms and made crimes for which Nixon and many others were dismissed legal. Since then, the President of the United States has the ability to declare war on whomever he wants and whenever he wants, even with the use of nuclear weapons. After September 11th, a patriotic frenzy took over the country. The propaganda of the arms lobbies flooded Washington, private armies were created, and the media fed the terrorist paranoia to exhaustion. As a result, the new measures were accepted by the vast majority of the population. The only critics came from independent internet channels, social activist groups, and foreign media. Virtually no one spoke of the economic interests behind the industry of war, or of the long American history of human rights violations in other countries. 5 years later, the American soldier Chelsea Manning leaked millions of secret files from the State Department on the war in Iraq and Afghanistan through WikiLeaks, a non-profit organization that reports illegalities around the world, and whose database accumulated more than 1 million documents of foreign policy in the United States, including military videos in which the world could see drones paid for by the taxes of Americans and sent by the Nobel Peace Prize winner Barack Obama, used to kill innocent civilians, while their murderers congratulated themselves, as if it were a video game.
Let me know when you gather. Light them all up. Come on, fire! Hey, Roger. Keep shoot. Keep shoot.
Bushmaster 2-6. Bushmaster 2-6. We need to move time now.
All right, we just engaged all 8 individuals. Yeah, we got 2 birds. We're still firing. Roger. Got him.
6 is a 2-6. We'll move, but we got 13.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was on
bypass.
God damn it, Kyle. All right. I hit him by head.
Intimidation and force have guaranteed empires impunity. Having the means of communication allows them to indoctrinate their citizens. The control of education makes the youth learn to obey and not to question the version of history that's taught in high schools and universities. The patriotic propaganda of the empire penetrates society, which, like in ancient Rome, only wants circuses and bread. And if it has them, it learns to glorify militarism and ignore its atrocities. Once that point is reached, it is easy to speak of their superiority over other races, countries, or religions, feeling special, chosen. That exceptionality only leads to justify new abuses and the condoning of more crimes. An example of this story, written by the winners, is the film version of the Second World War that is taught to children in American schools, according to which their country ended the conflict with Japan and saved millions of lives thanks to the launch of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The facts were quite different. President Truman had ignored the Japanese peace request and gave orders to use them in making a show of force to the Russians. The Japanese cities had already been bombed to their foundations. 80% were destroyed. It was the Russian invasion in Manchuria that convinced the Japanese to surrender. Atomic bombs influenced very little. It was undoubtedly the greatest terrorist attack in history. More than 300,000 people died, and the ever-present consequences were passed on for generations. A monstrosity, without any military justification, to which many American generals, including MacArthur, opposed. The current nuclear bombs are thousands of times more powerful than those launched on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 9 countries have nuclear weapons. The United States and Russia have almost 16,000. A nuclear war would end life on Earth entirely. Eliminating weapons is the most effective measure to avoid it. The arms race only leads to war. To accept it under any excuse or discourse of peace or war is to consent to our destruction. Peace is not a balance of terrors. The North American version of the Second World War proclaims that its army defeated the Nazis, but in reality, its troops, along with the British, fought only 10 German divisions, while the Russians faced 200. The most revealing fact is that in the Second World War, 400,000 Americans died, compared to 27 million Russians. In fact, the United States entered the conflict very late, and did so motivated mainly by wanting to secure the payments of the loans that its banks had given to France and England. Some of these same bankers bet on both sides and also financed the Nazis. An example is Prescott Bush, father and grandfather of the 2 American presidents. The enormous fortune of the Bushes had already begun to amass his father, Samuel P. Bush, who was general manager of Buckeye Steel Casting, the company that manufactured the railroads for the Rockefeller Oil Company, who in turn had the financial support of the Rothschilds. Prescott Bush belonged to the board of the Union Banking Corporation of New York, which financed the Nazi Fritz Thyssen, a patriarch of the industrial dynasty and art collectors. Prescott Bush was the general manager of a Nazi steel factory called Selection Consolidated Steel that used the prisoners of the famous Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland as slaves. Bush was accused by the U.S. government of collaboration with the enemy, and his shares of the Union Banking Corporation were confiscated. Prescott Bush also belonged to the powerful eugenics movement, initiated by the elites on both sides of the Atlantic, to control and select the population, on the basis of which it sterilized a large portion of society or killed those affected by physical or mental defects. The son of Prescott, George H.W. Bush, was the first director of the CIA who became President of the United States. His relationship with the agency came from the time of the dark murder of Kennedy, a crime surrounded by facts as surprising as the person appointed by President Johnson to investigate him. This was none other than Allen Dulles, who had been one of the most powerful interventionists and manipulative directors of the CIA, and whom Kennedy had fired 2 years earlier for the invasion of the Bay of Pigs, as well as the overthrow and murder of the president of the Congo, Patricio Lumumba, among other things. During the presidency of the first Bush, dictator and narco-trafficker Manuel Noriega worked for the CIA, allowing thousands of tons of cocaine to reach America. The second President Bush was associated with Salim bin Laden, the elder brother of Osama bin Laden, with whom he formed the company Arbusto Energy Oil. The bin Laden and Bush families were friends for more than 20 years and are partners in the huge Carlyle Group that includes Raytheon, one of the largest arms manufacturers. Through these 2 corporations, both family clans made multi-million-dollar profits during the Iraq War. In addition to ordering the invasion of Iraq, Bush hired Osama bin Laden to train the Mujahideen in the struggle to expel the Soviets and especially to reinstate the Taliban regime of Afghanistan, the world's largest producer of opium and heroin, and the key to control a business that moves more than $300 billion every year. George W. Bush was the one who declared bin Laden responsible for the attacks of September 11th, and in his search invaded the strategic Afghanistan. There, the North American troops would end up fighting against the soldiers who were armed and trained by his father. A major contribution of George Bush to the dark history of humanity is the Second Gulf War, in which the country invaded the second largest oil reserves in the world, an illegal decision taken by the United States, England, and Spain, against the will of the United Nations and against the majority opinion of the international community and the citizens of their own countries. The excuse was the existence of weapons of mass destruction, which were never found.
Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere. Nope, no weapons over there. Maybe under here.
The most disturbing thing about the powerful American war machine is that those who hold command in the United States are not included in the official government, but a government in the shadows formed by the Council of Foreign Relations, or CFR, the Pentagon, and 17 enormous security agencies, at the head of which are the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency. The CFR is a powerful group that represents the consensus of the American elites. It's outside of any democratic control and is only entered by invitation. In the last 60 years, it has established the objectives of the North American foreign policy according to the interests of its members. The CFR was created during the First World War and was funded in its infancy by the Rockefeller Foundation, as well as with the United Nations, the Bilderberg Club, and the CIA. The members of the CFR are politicians, military, businessmen, or more powerful artists. They belong to both majority parties, and among their objectives are globalization and to ultimately eliminate regulations that affect their multinational interests. The CFR chooses the wars it will create or in which the United States should intervene, and is also responsible for warping the official version of national history, propagating the myth of American altruistic interventionism and systematically denying the suffering inflicted by Washington to the rest of the world. This effort was accomplished in a coordination with the CIA, created in 1947 by the Rockefellers, by Wall Street lawyers, and by the owners of the major media companies like the New York Times, CBS, and the Washington Post. The media network of the CFR and the CIA determines the opinions and political tendencies of the vast majority of the American public point of view. The 1% gained a victory in 2010 when it obtained the knowledge that the Supreme Court of the United States legally equates corporations with people and gives them the rights such as freedom of expression, religion, and policy guarantees. This now allows companies to invest without limits in their lobbies for politicians to legislate in their favor or refuse to comply with laws that otherwise would be mandatory. Furthermore, unlike people, they do not die, which makes it easier for the elites to hand down their great fortunes, just as the Catholic Church has done for centuries.
But when more than 90% of the gains have gone to the top 1%, that's where the money is, and we are going to follow the money.
Currently, the Council of Foreign Relations is financed by more than 200 multinationals. It has 4,200 members, and from this, the majority of the governmental leaders are chosen. The CFR boasts 8 presidents of the United States, 24 secretaries of state, 16 secretaries of defense, 17 directors of the CIA, in addition to hundreds of general directors of the main multinationals, universities, and research centers. As for the National Security Agency, better known as the NSA, the documents that Edward Snowden revealed to the British newspaper The Guardian detailed a program of massive espionage to citizens originating from this agency, with the participation of the internet giants like Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, and Verizon Phone Company. Some agencies share espionage tasks, such as the FBI and the Intelligence and Defense Agency, which also carries out torture programs, other direct satellite programs, and space surveillance, such as the Office of National Recognition, which is carried out together with Google and the Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Others, such as the Joint Special Operations Command, function as secret armies of the President of the United States, and among other things, they are known to carry out assassinations and overthrow governments. The Pentagon and these 17 huge agencies constitute a government in the shadows, which works without having to surrender accounts to anyone, and inside the country they have more than 10,000 secret sites and 1,271 divisions, where at least 4.8 million people work with confidentiality contracts, similar to those of hundreds of thousands of employees from the 1,931 large corporations that are also military contractors. Any official or worker in this network who reveals secrets can end up in prison. Neither the citizens, Congress, nor the President know exactly how much money is spent by this government in the dark, which violates the first article of the Constitution. The annual defense budget is around $1 trillion and must be approved by a group of 48 congressmen and senators who form the Armed Services Committee of Congress. Each one of these politicians receives thousands of dollars a year from the top 5 weapons companies in the world. In this way, Congress, which is supposed to represent the citizens, is a place where the 1% kidnap American democracy.
My message, please help the Syrian. The Syrians need help now. You just stop the war, and we don't want to go to Europe. Just stop the war in Syria. Just that.
"41 million Americans live below the poverty line, and many others have no access to health care or education, because the resources needed to cover their basic needs end up being used to feed the greatest war machine that history has ever known." Concerning this shadow government, the military and financial industrial complex, the CFR, the Federal Reserve, the big banks, the lobbies of Israel and Saudi Arabia, the biggest American corporations, and the media constitute what is known as the deep state, and they are the ones who finance the campaigns of politicians. Their business wars are producing millions of deaths and misery throughout the world, but their greed makes the price seem justifiable to them.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
But don't be silent. Silence is the biggest weapon that's used against us. We don't want to be weird. We don't want to be different. We don't want to say anything at all. But that is demobilizing. That's the kind of thing that makes people think we don't care. That's the kind of thing that makes government officials think that they can get away with anything.
At the end of the Second World War, the United States used its abundant material resources to buy governments and Latin American dictatorships and sign numerous pacts of military aid to guarantee its influence in the region. In Panama, in 1946, they created the School of the Americas, in which Latin American officers were indoctrinated and the military was trained to repress the forces contrary to the interests of the United States and their own homelands. The subjects of this school of criminals include drug trafficking, torture, terrorism, and murder. This academy, which constitutes the largest base to destabilize non-aligned governments in Latin America and crush social movements, changed its headquarters in 1984 to Georgia, and in 2001, it was renamed the Institute for Security Cooperation in the Western Hemisphere, under which it continues its criminal brainwashing to this day. More than 60,000 soldiers from 23 countries in Latin America have graduated from this institution. Many are infamous for their crimes against humanity, such as Vladimiro Montesinos, Manuel Noriega, Omar Torrijos, Hugo Banzer, Herberto Lascanos, or Leopoldo Galtieri, who have led paramilitary groups, drug trafficking networks, death squads responsible for regime states, torture, and hundreds of thousands of murders. The United States military has intervened 56 times in Latin America. After the Second World War, the North Atlantic Organization, or NATO, was also created. Its initial objective was to contain the Soviet Union. 45 years later, when the Soviet Union disintegrated and the Cold War ended, its existence ceased to make sense. President Reagan assured Gorbachev that NATO would fall back, but in these 3 decades, the lobbies of the arms industry and commercial interests of the United States have made NATO continue to expand. And like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, it has become a tool for an elite that dreams of dominating the world.
Когда Советский Союз прекратил свое существование, тогда западные политики нам говорили, это не было зафиксировано на бумаге, но это точно совершенно было сказано, что а зачем тогда увеличивать военные расходы? Против кого воевать собрались? Здесь есть некоторые внутренние противоречия. Мы в себе уверены.
Великой Победы! Ура!
The military-industrial complex also has extensive markets within the United States. Sale of arms to citizens, armies of mercenaries such as Blackwater that do dirty work for the government around the world, militarization of the police, massive surveillance of the population, and of course, the monstrous prison system. The United States has 323 million inhabitants, 5% of the population of the entire planet. But in its territory, 25% of the world's prisoners can be found. In their jails, there are more than 2 million people, and outside of them, 7 million more are on probation. Those 9 million citizens cannot vote. They are mainly minorities, and among 39% of them are African Americans, despite only being 12% of the overall population.
Way
We have to look to history for the reasons for this injustice. The southern United States contained the largest concentration of slaves. Cotton was the oil of the time. When slavery was abolished, it was replaced by a system of racial segregation known as the Jim Crow laws that were only abolished in 1964, and which served so that the former slaves, now trapped by poverty, were condemned for any type of accusation or crime and ended up working again as slaves on the plantations and on the railways. Racism continued to triumph, and companies migrated south in search of cheap labor, thus birthing the current penitentiary system. With the globalization of recent decades, the industries wanted to increase their profits and save even more on labor, so they migrated again, this time to Asia and Latin America. The profits of the investors and the salaries of the executives soared, but thousands of factories were closed and millions of Americans were left without work. Crime in the streets increased and the consumption of narcotics skyrocketed. Large areas of the country fell into marginality. Once incarcerated, prisoners lose the right to vote and become semi-slave labor, who in exchange for a few cents an hour work from prison for multinationals and all kinds of trades. The manufacture of electronic components, parts for cars, clothing, furniture, military uniforms, packaged food, and hundreds of other products and services for companies such as McDonald's, Walmart, Johnson & Johnson, American Airlines, insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies such as Pfizer and Abbott, and they are even used to clean up environmental disasters of oil companies. Almost 40% of the firefighters in California are prisoners, which represents a $2 billion business. The prison labor force is ideal for a capitalist, neoliberal, and immoral system. Men and women confined to the workplace and willing to do so for even lower salaries than those working in Asia or Latin America, but with no possibility of vindication or justice and are unlimitedly available. It is estimated that each prisoner generates between $40,000 and $50,000 a year. This is the reason why a majority of prisons in the United States reach above 100% capacity. To supply this lucrative industry, the police are constantly raiding the poor neighborhoods. Once a person is arrested for possession, they are trapped in the judicial system. Most cannot afford a lawyer and are coerced to accept their guilt, leaving more than 90% to be convicted without trial. Thanks to the strict laws of the so-called war on drugs, currently almost 50% of prisoners in federal jails are in for the use of narcotics, half of those for marijuana use. Another important reason for mass imprisonment of the poorest minorities is their inability to pay fines, especially traffic tickets. In the sewers of the penitentiary complex, there are more than 3,000 people sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes without violence, some after committing minor crimes such as stealing a wallet. This happens thanks to a law that operates in 28 states and has been called the 3 strikes law, like in baseball. The law issues life imprisonment to anyone who has been sentenced twice and again commits another crime. The business is growing with the proliferation of private prisons. A single corporation called Unicor, which manages 83 federal prisons and employs hundreds of thousands of prisoners, earned $900 million in 2016. In the last 20 years, the number of inmates in this type of business have increased by 600%. The conditions are often overcrowded, and to provide more benefits, they cut back on medical services, maintenance, and food. In federal prisons, 75% of inmates are locked up for 23 hours a day in a 2x3 meter cell without windows for an average of 3 years. Almost half develop mental illnesses. There are 10 times more psychiatric patients in American prisons than in hospitals. The number of prisoners in the United States continues to grow despite the fact that crime has decreased for more than 20 years. The reason being that this penitentiary system that comes from the era of slavery is still a multi-million-dollar industry and a tool of social control. Prince, who died on April 21, 2016, was one of almost 100,000 victims who die every year because of a programmed and lucrative epidemic that kills more people in the United States than firearms and car accidents together: the addiction to opioids. In the United States, there are over 2 million people addicted to these substances. The main cause is the pressure of the powerful pharmaceutical lobby that got the government to promote its use as painkillers and facilitate its distribution on a massive scale. The pharmaceutical industry is one of the biggest frauds based on artificial insufficiency in the knowledge of monopolies and in social manipulation. Purdue Pharma, the company that invented OxyContin, has generated billions of dollars for its owners, the Sackler family, pioneers of pharmaceutical marketing and famous patrons of arts and universities. Millions of Americans become addicted thanks to the advice of their general practitioners and pharmacies, instructed to prescribe and sell opioid painkillers, and backed by studies paid by the same industry that invented these harmful substances and downplay the risk of dependence, as well as suggested that up to 30% of Americans suffer from chronic pain. Every 3 weeks, the same number of people who died in the attacks on the Twin Towers die from addiction to narcotic opioids. The social alarm that has caused the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives in these years has caused the company Purdue Pharma to reorient its commercial efforts towards countries where they can continue making profit with the narcotics. According to Forbes magazine, the Sacklers are the 19th richest family in the United States, with a fortune of $14 billion.
Let me understand what you're saying. A ton of cocaine was smuggled into the United States of America by the Venezuelan National Guard in cooperation with the CIA?
That's exactly what appears to have happened.
In the 1980s, another similar epidemic caused hundreds of thousands of deaths, in which the CIA played a decisive role, facilitating cocaine trafficking to the United States in order to finance the guerrilla fighting against the democratic government of Nicaragua. As the Kerry report of the American Senate Foreign Relations Committee concluded, historically, the CIA has been involved in narcotic trafficking in Afghanistan, Mexico, Panama, and Venezuela, and has used it to finance their operations and to gain the support of the mafias.
It was a question of supporting people who supported our economic and political philosophies in other parts of the world, and they happen to be drug dealers, as most of them are. We supported them and we protected them.
Wars are private business. made in the name of countries. They kill with the most modern military technology, but the majority of the victims are innocent civilians. They are killed with precision and in silence, with drones and satellites, or with a more lethal weapon, misery. All without us seeing it, so there is no noise, so that we do not oppose, so that we remain obsessed with our small lives full of debts and needs, where the other does not exist. The 1% are the real commanders of the armies like the United States. Unscrupulous businessmen whose children do not go to war, and for whom the precariousness of others is necessary. All armies in the world don't produce anything. They only consume. In addition to the industry that surrounds them and the numerous consequences of wars, they are the greatest source of pollution on the planet. But that 1% does not worry. The stratospheric debt of their countries helps to force the agenda of a new world order, in which its mafia cartel of central banks keeps the scam making money out of nothing, while its international institutions continue to confiscate power right from our hands. In order to continuously supply labor, the armed forces of the United States spends millions on deceptive advertising, aimed primarily at the poorest in society. Most of them only sign up for economic reasons and lack of opportunities. The claim to a decent job, professional training, and the patriotism with which they have been indoctrinated since birth is the mixture that leads them to fight in the name of an empire whose greed does not hesitate to sacrifice them, to obey orders of leaders who do not represent them and who are architects of the misery in which they live, because only then can they have slaves and soldiers. Slaves who in their ignorance proudly wear their chains, and soldiers willing to kill or be killed in the name of a lie they do not dare to question. The first British settlers who came to America wanted to fill themselves with glory and riches, and at the same time make a city on a hill in the name of God. With the first idea in mind, they did not hesitate to carry out a genocide. With the second, they did not take long to justify it. During the following centuries, the same greed and moral exceptionalism has led a part of their descendants to do the same all over the world.
In God, I believe in the Bible, I'm a Christian.
The only chance we have of being free is not to listen to those who hide behind the name of God or the hope of peace for us to believe their lies. Their greed makes them confuse the limits of their homeland with the limits of humanity, and they want to divide and conquer at all costs. Because their greatest fear is that we realize that we are one race, the human race, and we must decide to act as such. To prevent the killings and suicides in the name of our country, our skin color, or our religion, we will have to put aside our fears and our comforts. History will not wait for us to gain the courage. We will have to go to the street in search of this boldness and rebel. Only then can we rewrite our destinies. Ignoring history leaves us with no choice but to repeat it. Not trying for peace plunges us into nightmares. The cowardice that prevents us from facing those who oppress others make us all oppressed. Our lack of support for those who struggle to be free leaves us all without freedom. The only opportunity that peace has lives in the mind of each person, in their ability to self-educate and resist.
6 dias intensos e cheios de emoção, multidões, fé e na despedida forte apelo de Papa que não é comum. Francisco incitou os jovens a irem contra a corrente.
Sejam revolucionários. Eu peço que vocês de irem contra a corrente. Sim, nisto peço
che se rebellen.
Our power is in what we can do, in changing concrete things that are within our reach, in not consuming the products that maintain empires, in leaving the social networks that run away with our data, in preventing our resources from being privatized, and not giving our consent to corruption, and not allowing arms to be bought with our taxes. 99% of the population has already begun to speak out against violence and injustice. The world wants peace, and 7 billion people cannot be wrong.
I pledge you that we shall neither commit nor provoke aggression, that we shall neither flee nor invoke the threat of force, that we shall never negotiate out of fear, and we shall never fear to negotiate.
And that is the most important topic on earth, peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women.